The room felt heavy with tension, as if the very air itself was thickening with every passing second. A young black boy sat alone in the dimly lit interrogation room, his heart pounding in his chest. Sweat dripped down his forehead, not from fear, but from the intensity of what he was being put through. He was just 16, barely old enough to drive, and yet here he was, locked in a room with a man whose eyes were filled with a coldness that sent a chill down his spine. The man across from him, Detective Evans, had already made it clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary questioning. It was an interrogation, one that seemed more about proving a point than finding answers. For hours the questions came relentlessly, each one more accusatory than the last. The detective's voice was sharp, laced with suspicion, like he had already made up his mind about the boy's guilt. "Where were you last night?" the detective asked, his voice hard as stone. "What were you doing on that street? You know it's not safe for someone like you to be walking around there, don't you?" The words stung, but the boy remained silent, knowing that speaking could easily twist things in a way that could ruin his life forever. The boy tried to keep his composure, but the pressure was suffocating. He had done nothing wrong, but in that room, it didn't matter. To the detective, he was already guilty. To the officer, it wasn't about justice. It was about a preconceived notion that had already shaped everything he believed about this boy, simply because of the color of his skin. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of treatment, but it was the first time it felt like it was going to break him. He had always tried to stay strong, but there was something about the way Detective Evans looked at him that made him feel small. Hours passed, each one dragging on, and just when he thought he couldn't take much more, something changed. The door creaked open, and in the silence of the room, the sound was deafening. For a moment, the boy's heart stopped, wondering if maybe this was it. Maybe they were done with him. Maybe he was going home. But when he turned to see who was standing in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. A new figure stood in the doorway. A tall man in a suit, his face stern but not unkind. He didn't say a word at first, just stepped in, his gaze briefly meeting the detective's. Detective Evans' expression faltered for just a split second, a crack in his otherwise steely demeanor. It was like a silent exchange had taken place in that brief moment, something the boy couldn't quite understand, but it was enough to make the detective hesitate. "Is there a problem here, officer?" The new man finally spoke, his voice calm but commanding. There was an authority in his words that made the boy feel like maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to stand up for him. The detective's eyes narrowed, clearly irritated by the interruption, but he didn't respond right away. The tension in the room was palpable. The boy looked between the two men, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this new person? What was his connection to all of this? And why was he here now, at this very moment, when things were at their worst? The seconds felt like minutes as the boy's mind raced. Detective Evans, still staring at the new arrival, seemed to weigh his options. The room was quiet again, too quiet. The boy's thoughts swirled with uncertainty, unsure of whether this was the help he had been waiting for, or if things were about to take an even darker turn. And then, before anyone could speak again, there was another sound, the faintest knock, a small tap against the door. It was almost as if the universe itself had timed it perfectly. The knock echoed in the silence, and for the boy, it was like a spark of hope had ignited inside him. But what did it mean? Who was at the door? Was it someone coming to rescue him, or was it something else entirely? His heart raced as he looked toward the door, hoping against hope that this was the moment that everything changed. The tension was so thick now that it felt like the air might burst into flames at any second. Would he finally be freed from this nightmare, or was this just the beginning of something even worse? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. The real question is, who is knocking at that door? And what happens when the boy's fate takes an unexpected turn? The knock echoed again, more urgent this time, as if it had a purpose. The boy's gaze shot to the door, his heart racing. It was a small sound, but it seemed to carry the weight of the entire situation. It felt like a lifeline, but also a new wave of uncertainty. What did it mean? Was someone there to help him? Or was this just another twist in the long, drawn-out nightmare he had been trapped in? Detective Evans remained motionless, staring at the man who had entered the room. The newcomer, tall and composed, didn't break his gaze either. It was a moment of quiet tension, each of them sizing the other up, trying to gauge the other's move. The boy, still sitting on the metal chair, could feel the heat of their stares as if he were invisible, but also the center of their attention all at once. Everything was moving in slow motion. The knock came again. It was louder now, deliberate, and there was no mistaking it. Someone was outside, and they were waiting. The boy wanted to scream, to ask who was at the door, to demand that someone explain what was happening. But he couldn't speak. It felt like his throat was closing up, his body stiffening with every passing moment. He knew that saying the wrong thing might send everything spiraling into a deeper mess. He had already learned the hard way that in a room like this, silence could be both a weapon and a curse. The man in the suit finally broke the silence. "Detective Evans, I'll take it from here." The words hung in the air for a moment, leaving a strange sense of finality. The boy could barely process what he had just heard. Was this new man in charge? Did he have the authority to end this interrogation? He didn't know, but something about the way he spoke made it clear that Detective Evans wasn't in control anymore. Evans didn't respond at first, his jaw clenched, his fists slowly tightening by his sides. For a split second, it looked like he might argue, but then he seemed to think better of it. He straightened up, nodded stiffly, and turned to leave the room. As he passed the door, he gave the boy a final cold look, his eyes narrowing as if this wasn't over. He was done for now, but the boy knew that wouldn't be the last time he'd see him. It never was. The door clicked shut behind Evans, and the boy let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He wasn't sure if he felt relief, or if it was just another layer of the trap being pulled away, leaving him exposed. The man in the suit turned slowly, his eyes now focused entirely on the boy. The silence between them felt like a pressure that was closing in from every angle. The boy could barely breathe under the weight of it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man studied him carefully, like he was weighing something important in his mind. The boy couldn't help but wonder who this man was and what his intentions were. He wasn't here to interrogate him like Detective Evans. He didn't have that same air of accusation, but there was something else, something cold and calculating about the way he looked at him. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was calm, even, but there was an underlying edge to it that made the boy's stomach twist. "Are you all right?" The boy didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he didn't feel all right. He felt trapped, suffocated, as if every move he made was being watched, scrutinized. But there was something in the man's question that seemed genuine, not like the usual suspicion he had encountered. There was no judgment in his tone, no preconceived notion about who the boy was or what he had done. For the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe just a little bit easier. I'm fine," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time in a long while he had been asked how he was. His words didn't sound convincing, even to himself. The man nodded, his face softening slightly. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I know this has been difficult for you. You've been under a lot of pressure." He paused, as though searching for the right words. "But I need you to understand something. I'm here to help you, all right." The boy looked up at him, disbelief flashing across his face. Help him? He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Was this just another game? Another person trying to manipulate him, to control the narrative of his life? He had been through too much already, and trust was a fragile thing. "I don't know who you are," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly. "Why should I trust you?" The man's expression remained steady, but there was a flicker of something. Maybe understanding, maybe regret. "Fair enough," he said softly. "But let me explain. My name is Detective Holloway. I'm from the Civil Rights Division. I've been following this case for a while now." The boy's eyes widened at the mention of the division. Civil rights? Was this really happening? Was someone actually here to help him, to fight against the injustice he had faced for so long? Before he could respond, another knock came at the door, louder than before, as if someone was pushing to get in. The boy's breath caught in his throat. The tension returned, thicker this time, as if everything was teetering on the edge of some great unknown. Detective Holloway's eyes flicked toward the door before meeting the boy's gaze again. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll handle this. Just trust me." The boy nodded, though his heart was racing. Who else could be at the door? He couldn't help but wonder what was going on. This was his life on the line, and every decision, every word that was spoken, felt like it would change everything. The knock came again, louder this time, and the boy felt his nerves tighten, the room suddenly feeling smaller, as if it was closing in on him. Detective Holloway's calm demeanor didn't match the storm brewing inside him. The boy couldn't read the man's face, but something about the way he stood so still made it seem like there was more to this than he was letting on. Holloway took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the door. There was no hesitation in his movements as he walked over to it, but the boy couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen next was going to change everything. The seconds stretched on, the room heavy with anticipation. The boy's mind raced. Was this the cavalry he had been waiting for? Or was it another part of the same system that had trapped him in the first place? Before he could process his thoughts any further, Holloway reached for the door handle. He didn't open it immediately, though. Instead, he glanced back at the boy, giving him one last look of reassurance. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Trust me." The boy didn't know what to think. He didn't know who to trust anymore. But there was something in Holloway's eyes, a glimmer of something real, something different from the cold calculations of Detective Evans, that made him want to believe. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe there was someone who saw him as more than just a target. Holloway swung open the door. Standing on the other side was a man the boy had never seen before. Tall, wearing a dark jacket, with a face that was hard to read. His presence was imposing, but there was something in the air, something subtle, that made the boy uneasy. The new figure didn't say a word, only stepped into the room, his eyes scanning every corner like he was looking for something. Holloway didn't flinch. He looked the man up and down, and for a brief moment, there was a silent exchange between the two. The boy couldn't place it, but something was off. This wasn't just a new character entering the scene. There was a deeper connection, something tangled and complicated between them, something neither of them was saying. The newcomer finally spoke, his voice deep but measured. "The situation's getting worse. We need to move quickly." The boy felt a knot form in his stomach. He had no idea who this person was or what he meant by worse, but the word hit him like a punch to the gut. The tension in the room skyrocketed. Holloway nodded, his face hardening. "I know," he said simply. "We've been patient, but it's time we take action." The boy's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Take action. What was going on? Was this part of the plan? Or was this just the beginning of something even more dangerous? His gaze flicked between Holloway and the man in the jacket, trying to make sense of it all. Holloway stepped back from the door, but the man didn't enter the room fully. Instead, he turned his head toward the boy. "You're not safe here," he said flatly, his eyes narrowing. "This whole situation is a trap. They've been watching you. They've been watching us." The boy's heart skipped a beat. "Who's they?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The man's lips twitched, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "It's complicated," he replied, his tone low and cryptic. "But they're the reason you're here. The reason you're being treated like this." He paused, as if weighing whether to reveal more. "The reason they're setting you up." The boy recoiled at the words. Set up? Was this all some kind of conspiracy? Was he being framed? Everything he thought he knew about his situation started to feel like a lie. He had been questioned, accused of things he didn't do, and now he was hearing that it wasn't just random, it was part of something much bigger. Holloway's voice cut through the tension. "Don't listen to him," he said quickly, but his tone was defensive, almost too quick. He glanced at the man in the jacket, a flash of anger crossing his face. "We need to be careful what we say right now. The walls have ears." The boy felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Walls have ears. Who were these people? What was happening? He had been trapped in this room for hours, questioning every look, every word, and now everything was suddenly so much bigger than he could comprehend. He wanted to escape, to run, but he was trapped. Trapped by this game, trapped by these people, trapped in his own confusion. The boy opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, unsure of what to say. The weight of everything was starting to settle in. He had never been in a situation like this before. How had everything gotten so complicated, so dangerous? The door behind them creaked slightly, and the boy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Holloway turned quickly, his hand resting on the door handle as if he were preparing to bolt. The man in the jacket seemed unfazed by the rising tension in the room. "You're still safe for now," he said, his voice unbuffered. "But that won't last long. Things are about to escalate, and you'll need to be ready." The boy's heart thudded in his chest. Things were escalating. What did that even mean? Was there a way out of this? Or was he stuck in a game that had already been set in motion without his knowledge? Just as he was about to ask another question, the sound of footsteps in the hallway cut through the quiet of the room. Holloway froze, his eyes flicking toward the door, then back to the boy. His expression was hardening, like he was preparing for something terrible. "Stay quiet," he repeated, his voice stern. The boy could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The steps outside the door grew louder, closer. They were coming for him. The footsteps grew louder, and the boy's breath caught in his throat. Holloway's eyes never left the door, his jaw clenched as though he were preparing for an imminent confrontation. The boy could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, the ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance, but all of it seemed distant now. The only thing that mattered was the sound of those footsteps. They were closing in. The man in the jacket hadn't moved, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every detail of the room, as if he were anticipating something, waiting for it to happen. He didn't speak, but the tension in his posture was palpable, his fists clenched at his sides. The boy could see the muscles in his jaw twitching slightly, the only sign that the man was feeling the pressure. Holloway took a slow step back from the door, his eyes narrowing. "They're coming," he whispered, the words hanging in the air like a warning. The boy's chest tightened. "What do we do?" He managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. Holloway didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked between the boy and the man in the jacket. There was something in the way they looked at each other that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. Was Holloway trying to protect him, or was he just trying to protect his own interests? The boy couldn't tell anymore. The more they spoke in riddles, the more unsure he became. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, everything was silent. The boy couldn't breathe. He didn't dare move. His entire body felt frozen in place, like the air around him had thickened, and he was trapped inside it. The seconds stretched on, impossibly long, and he wondered if his heart was about to explode from the pressure. Then the door handle slowly turned. The boy's pulse quickened. His eyes darted between Holloway and the man in the jacket, waiting for someone to make a move. Should he speak up? Should he run? But his legs felt like lead, and his voice caught in his throat. He could only watch, helpless, as the door creaked open. A figure stepped into the room, filling the doorway with their presence. It was another officer, dressed in full uniform. The boy didn't recognize him, but the uniform alone told him everything he needed to know. Another part of the system, another face in the endless line of authority that had been stacked against him. Holloway didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the new arrival, but the boy noticed the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the door. There was something dangerous in the way Holloway was holding himself, like a predator waiting to pounce. The new officer stepped inside, his eyes quickly scanning the room. The boy felt a surge of fear course through him. Was this the moment everything would fall apart? Would they arrest him, drag him away, and throw him into a cell with no one to fight for him? The officer didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, his eyes flicking between the boy and Holloway, as if trying to gauge the situation. The silence stretched on, thick with uncertainty. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice cold and calculated. "You need to come with me," he said, his eyes never leaving the boy. "Now." The boy's stomach twisted. What did that mean? Was this it? Was he about to be taken into custody, shuffled through the system like so many others? He didn't know how to respond. His mouth felt dry, and for a second, he couldn't even find the words. But before he could say anything, the man in the jacket stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "No one is going anywhere until we get some answers," he said firmly, his tone full of authority. The boy couldn't tell whether the man was speaking to Holloway or the officer, but the command in his voice was undeniable. The officer's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing slightly. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. The man in the jacket didn't answer immediately. He simply stood taller, his eyes locking with the officer's in a silent standoff. The room felt like it was holding its breath, and the boy's chest tightened with anxiety. What was about to happen? What did the man in the jacket mean by getting answers? Was this some kind of undercover operation, or was he just getting swept up in something much larger than he could understand? "I don't have time for games," the officer said, his voice growing sharper. "Either you move, or I'll move you myself." The boy's heart slammed against his ribs. The officer was getting closer. The air felt charged, like something big was about to happen. He glanced at Holloway, but the detective didn't seem to be reacting. He was still standing there, his eyes focused on the officer. The silence grew heavier with every passing second, stretching longer, becoming unbearable. Then, without warning, the man in the jacket moved. His hand shot out, grabbing the officer by the arm, his grip strong and unyielding. The boy could barely believe his eyes. What was happening? Was this a fight breaking out right in front of him? Was this the chaos he had been waiting for, or had something gone horribly wrong? "You don't want to do this," the man in the jacket said in a low, controlled voice, his grip tightening. "You really don't." The officer's eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he was considering his options, but then the tension snapped. The officer jerked his arm free, his hand moving to his belt, where his weapon was holstered. The boy's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment that everything came to a head. The moment the room would erupt in chaos. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. As the officer's hand hovered near his sidearm, a split second passed, filled with anticipation. Then, everything changed in an instant. The door behind the officer swung open once more. Just as the officer's hand hovered near his sidearm, the door behind him swung open again, slamming against the wall with a loud crash. The boy's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see a new figure enter the room, this one moving with an unsettling calmness. This wasn't just anyone. The boy didn't recognize him, but the look on the officer's face told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't an ordinary person. It was someone with power, someone who could change everything in an instant. The new figure stepped into the room with a purpose, his footsteps slow and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. His presence filled the room, and even the officer seemed to shrink back slightly, his hand withdrawing from his weapon as if sensing something was wrong. The boy watched, wide-eyed, as the newcomer's cold gaze swept over the scene. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, his face expressionless, but his eyes were full of something darker. "Step away from him," the new figure said, his voice low but commanding. There was no hesitation in his words, and the officer didn't argue. He stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of confusion and begrudging compliance. The man in the jacket released his grip on the officer's arm, his expression darkening, but he didn't move from his spot. The air felt thick with uncertainty, like the room was about to explode. The boy's mind raced. Who was this person? Why was he here? And why did he seem so dangerous? The boy had been through a lot that day, but something about this man made his gut twist in a way he couldn't explain. There was a coldness to him that made the boy feel as if he was standing on the edge of something he didn't fully understand. "I'm not here to play games," the man in the suit continued, his voice cutting through the room. "This is bigger than you realize. You're all just pawns in a game that's far beyond your understanding, and the clock is ticking." The officer stood back, his hands still hovering near his belt, unsure of what to do next. But the new figure didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the boy now, as if he were assessing him, weighing him like a commodity or an obstacle. The boy felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an interrogation anymore. It wasn't just about who was right and who was wrong. This was something else, something darker. Holloway, standing by the door, had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now his eyes flicked between the man in the suit and the officer, his expression unreadable. The boy could feel the tension between them, the standoff simmering just beneath the surface. He wondered what was happening behind those steely eyes. Who was Holloway really working for? And why was this new figure here? What had he stepped into? "You think you know what's going on," the man in the suit said, breaking the silence and focusing on Holloway now. "But you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. This isn't about one kid. This is about something much bigger than all of you." The words hit the boy like a punch to the gut. Bigger than all of them. What was going on? What were they all talking about? He had spent so long just trying to figure out why he was being accused, why he was being targeted, but now it felt like everything he had known was slipping through his fingers. He had no answers. He had no idea who he could trust anymore. "Explain yourself," Holloway said, his voice firm, though his hands were clenched at his sides, betraying his own tension. The man in the suit's eyes flicked to him, then back to the boy. He took a slow step forward, his presence commanding the room even more. "I don't have time to explain everything," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "But you need to know one thing. They've been watching you for months. They know your every move, and they'll do whatever it takes to silence you." The boy's head spun. Who was they? And what did they want with him? Every word the man said only deepened the mystery, pulling him deeper into a web of lies and manipulation. He felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing with the possibilities, each one darker than the last. It was all coming together, but he still couldn't see the full picture. The only thing he knew for sure was that whoever they were, they had far more power than anyone in this room, and they weren't playing by the rules. "You've been part of their plan all along," the man in the suit continued, his gaze never leaving the boy. "The way they've been grooming you, using you as a pawn. You thought it was just about an accusation, a simple interrogation, but you're the key to something much bigger, something that could change everything." The boy's stomach churned. He couldn't wrap his mind around what the man was saying. How could he be the key? What was he even talking about? Was he really just a pawn in some larger game? Was his life nothing more than a piece on someone else's chessboard? His thoughts felt scrambled, overwhelmed by the weight of what was being revealed. Every word, every new detail only added more confusion, pushing him further into a state of panic. Holloway's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "You're lying," he snapped, his hands tightening into fists. "This is some kind of—" But the man in the suit cut him off with a sharp look, his eyes piercing. "I'm not lying, detective. You've seen the signs. You've felt the pressure. This is a carefully orchestrated plan, and you're all in the middle of it." The boy couldn't breathe. His head swam with questions, with fears, with confusion. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his voice betrayed him. All he could do was stand there, helpless, as the room around him seemed to close in tighter, the air thick with the weight of secrets that were just out of reach. Suddenly, the sound of distant sirens cut through the silence, a harsh reminder of the reality outside the walls. The boy's heart raced again, his mind spinning. Were they here? Was this the end? The sirens grew louder, closer now, as if the entire world was about to come crashing down on him. And yet, as the man in the suit turned toward the door, his eyes locked with the boy's for one last moment, his lips curling into a cold smile. "It's not over yet," he said softly. "This is just the beginning." The boy stood frozen in place, the room spinning around him, as the weight of the man's words hung in the air like a threat. The tension was unbearable. The man in the suit turned, his cold smile still lingering as he made his way toward the door. The officer stepped aside without a word, his face pale, his hand still nervously hovering near his weapon. The room seemed to hold its breath, the boy's heart pounding in his chest. The sirens outside were growing louder, now echoing through the walls like a countdown. The boy didn't know whether he should run or stay, but he could feel the walls closing in, his every instinct screaming that something was about to explode. Just as the man reached for the door, Holloway's voice cut through the tension, sharp and desperate. "Wait," he shouted, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and determination. "What the hell do you mean? This is just the beginning." The man in the suit stopped, his hands still resting on the door. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with Holloway's. For a moment, the two of them stood there, the silence thick with unspoken history, with the weight of everything that had led to this point. The boy felt like an outsider, like he wasn't even part of the conversation anymore, just a spectator in a game he didn't understand. But he couldn't look away. "Everything's been set in motion," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an eerie certainty. "You think this is just about a kid and some racially motivated incident. It's much bigger than that, detective. Much bigger than anything you've seen. They've been playing this game for years, and now you're all caught in it." Holloway stepped forward, his face hardening. "I don't know who you think you are, but I won't let you drag him into whatever sick game you're part of. This kid is not some pawn." The man in the suit didn't flinch. He simply looked back at the boy, his gaze colder now, more calculating. "You think Holloway's the only one who's been watching you?" he asked. "Think again. They've been tracking you for months, studying your every move, waiting for the right moment to use you. And that moment is now." The boy's stomach twisted. His whole life, his every decision, had led him to this point. He had been marked, controlled, and played by forces he didn't understand. He wasn't just a victim in a single case. He was the center of something far larger, something he couldn't even grasp. His mind was racing, desperate for clarity, for answers, but nothing made sense. Then, just as the man in the suit opened the door to leave, the sound of a familiar voice rang out from the hallway, shattering the tense stillness. "Wait." The boy's heart leaped in his chest. It was her, the one person he hadn't seen in what felt like forever, the one person he had clung to for hope, his mother. She burst through the door, breathless, her eyes wide with panic and determination. She didn't even look at the officer or the man in the suit. Her eyes were locked on the boy. "You need to come with me, now." The boy's breath caught in his throat. "Mom," he whispered, disbelief flooding his mind. "What's going on? What are you doing here?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the chaos that surrounded them. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice low, frantic. "You're in more danger than you realize. All of this, it's all connected. I can explain everything, but we need to move. Now." The boy felt a surge of confusion. His mind was spinning. Was this the woman who had always been his protector? The woman who had fought for him, who had promised to keep him safe? But something in her eyes, the urgency, the fear, told him that things were far worse than he had ever imagined. As Holloway moved to block their exit, the man in the suit's voice rang out one last time, chilling the air. "She's lying to you," he said, his words cold as ice. "She's been part of this from the start." The boy's legs trembled, his heart pounding. His mother, part of it? How could that be? How could she be involved in whatever twisted web had ensnared him? He wanted to believe her, but the doubt in his mind was growing louder with every passing second. Was she really trying to save him? Or was she just another part of the trap? Before he could ask another question, The officer took a step forward, drawing his weapon, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm not letting you take him," he said, his voice shaking. "This ends now." But before anyone could react, Holloway lunged forward, knocking the officer's gun from his hands with a swift move. The boy could see the struggle in Holloway's eyes. He didn't want to be part of this, didn't want to be caught in whatever game was being played. But the man in the suit simply watched, his expression unreadable. His mother yanked the boy's arm once again, pulling him toward the door. "Come on," she'd urged, her voice desperate. "We don't have much time." But just as they were about to cross the threshold, the room exploded in noise. A deafening crash echoed through the walls, and the lights flickered, casting the room into darkness for a split second. The boy's heart raced, panic flooding his chest. When the lights came back on, everything had changed. The officer, Holloway, the man in the suit, they were all frozen in place, staring at something or someone just outside the door. The boy could hear the sound of more footsteps, heavier this time, boots clanging on the floor. A shadow loomed in the doorway, blocking the light, and for a split second, the boy's mind went blank. Then he saw them. A group of people, armed and serious-looking, stepped into the room. They wore no uniforms, just dark clothes and faces that were as cold as the man in the suit. The boy's stomach dropped. "This is bigger than all of you," one of them said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You're all in the way now." The boy felt the world tilt beneath him as he realized the final truth. Everything that had happened, the interrogation, the threats, the mystery, had all been part of something much larger than he could have ever imagined. And now, the real game was just beginning. As the new arrivals moved toward them, the boy's mother pulled him close, her grip fierce. "You have to trust me," she whispered urgently. "They've been watching us both, but this is your chance to escape." And with that, the boy knew his life would never be the same again. The truth was finally beginning to surface, but it wasn't what he expected. It was darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And as the figures closed in, he realized that there was only one thing left to do: run. The boy's heart hammered in his chest as the figures in dark clothing moved toward them, their boots heavy on the floor with every step. His mother's grip tightened on his arm, her fingers digging into his skin, as if she could somehow protect him from what was coming. The room was filled with a tense, oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of the distant sirens that had been growing louder. The door had barely been closed before these new figures entered, sealing their fate. The boy's thoughts swirled with confusion, his mind struggling to make sense of everything that had happened. What was going on? Who were these people? And why was his mother so desperate to get him out of here? "We have to go," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling but resolute. She was no longer the calm, reassuring figure he had known. Something in her eyes, something in the way she was acting, made him realize that she wasn't just scared for him. She was scared for both of them. The boy wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what was happening, but his instincts kicked in. He didn't have time for answers. He had to trust her. He had no choice. Before he could take another step, one of the armed figures in the doorway spoke, his voice cold and commanding. "It's no use. You're not going anywhere." The boy froze, feeling the weight of those words settle over him like a heavy stone. There was no escape. Not like this. Not now. But his mother didn't hesitate. She turned toward the door, her eyes locked on him. "Run," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Go." The boy didn't understand how she could be so sure, but as the figures closed in on them, something deep inside told him that she was right. The time for hesitation was over. He turned on his heel, bolting toward the back exit, his legs pumping with adrenaline as he dashed through the hallway. The sound of running footsteps echoed behind him, but he didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead. His mother's words rang in his ears. "This is your chance to escape." He didn't know who these people were, or what they wanted with him, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to get out of there. The hallways twisted and turned, unfamiliar and claustrophobic, but he kept his focus. He had never felt so alive, so terrified, and so determined all at once. Each step was a gamble, but he was running for his life. As he reached the exit, he skidded to a halt. The door was locked. He fumbled for the handle, panic bubbling up inside him. His breath came in short gasps, his body slick with sweat as he struggled to open the door. Behind him, the footsteps were getting closer. The figures in the dark clothes were closing in, and he could hear their heavy breathing. He was running out of time. With one final push, he yanked the door open and sprinted into the night air. The coolness hit him like a slap, but he didn't have time to enjoy it. He had to keep moving. The city streets stretched out before him, a blur of lights and sounds, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't, not when every step brought him closer to freedom. The boy's mind was spinning. His whole life had been upended in the span of a few hours, but there was no time to process, no time for questions, only action. He ran and ran until the sound of footsteps behind him began to fade. When he finally allowed himself to stop, gasping for air, he glanced over his shoulder. No one was in sight. He had lost them, at least for now. His chest heaved as he leaned against a wall, his legs trembling. He didn't know where he was or what he was supposed to do next, but he couldn't just keep running forever. He had to find answers. He had to understand what was happening to him and why. But before he could collect his thoughts, a familiar voice cut through the silence, startling him. "Are you okay?" He whipped around, his pulse spiking. There, standing in the shadows, was his mother. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with relief. She stepped forward slowly, almost cautiously, as if she feared he might run again. "Mom," the boy breathed, his voice cracking. "What's going on? What is all this?" She reached out and pulled him into a tight hug, her arms enveloping him as if she never wanted to let go. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted you to get dragged into this, but you were always going to be part of it. They've been watching you, waiting for the right moment to make their move. And now you have to know the truth." The boy pulled back slightly, still reeling from everything that had happened. "What truth? What are you talking about?" His mother took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't want to tell you this, but it's time. The truth is, we've been part of something much bigger than we ever realized. There's a network, a group of people who have been manipulating events from the shadows for years. They control everything, the police, the media, even the government. And you're the key to their plan." The boy's mind spun. "I'm the key," he repeated, barely able to process her words. "What does that even mean?" "They've been grooming you," she continued, her voice tinged with both fear and regret. "They knew your potential before you even did. They've been watching you, tracking every move, every decision you've made. And now, they want to use you for something more than just an ordinary life." He felt the weight of her words sinking in, the reality of everything he'd just learned threatening to crush him. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me?" "I wanted to," she said softly, shaking her head. "But I couldn't. They would have found out. They were already watching us. I couldn't risk you. But now we have no choice. You need to be ready." He stared at her, trying to make sense of it all. The truth was so much darker than he had imagined. He had thought this was just about a few bad cops, some racism, maybe an unfair accusation. But now it felt like his whole life had been part of something much bigger. The boy didn't know if he was angry, confused, or scared. Maybe he was all three. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch reassuring despite the chaos around them. "You're not alone in this. You never were." The boy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything settle in his chest. There was no going back. The game had changed, and now he had to play it, whether he was ready or not. But as he stood there, with his mother by his side, he realized one thing. No matter what came next, he was going to fight. He wasn't going to be a pawn anymore. As the night stretched on, He knew that the battle was only beginning. But now, at least, he had a fighting chance.